What if I told you that one of the finest semi-automatic rifles ever made was rendered obsolete almost the moment it entered service? A weapon so well engineered that soldiers loved it, so accurate that it remains prized by collectors today, yet so perfectly timed to arrive at exactly the wrong moment in history that it never got the recognition it deserved. This is the FN49. A rifle that represents both the pinnacle of one era and the sunset of an entire philosophy of small arms design. The Fabrique Nationale, Model 1949, or FN49, stands as one of the great what-if stories in military firearms history. Here was a semi-automatic rifle that did everything right. It was reliable, accurate, well-balanced, and built with the legendary Belgian craftsmanship that made FN a household name among firearms enthusiasts. Soldiers who carried it praised its performance. Engineers admired its clever design solutions. Collectors today consider it one of the most desirable military surplus rifles you can own. But the FN49 had one fatal flaw that no amount of engineering brilliance could overcome: timing. By the time it reached production in 1949, the world had already decided that the future belonged to select-fire assault rifles, not traditional semi-automatic battle rifles. The FN49 was the last hurrah of a dying breed, a beautifully engineered answer to a question the military world had stopped asking. Yet its story deserves to be told, because in many ways this forgotten rifle was actually ahead of its time, bridging the gap between the M1 Garand and the FAL that would eventually dominate the Cold War battlefield. To understand the FN49, we need to go back to the 1930s. The Belgian designer Dieudonné Saive was working at Fabrique Nationale in Herstal, collaborating with the legendary John Browning. When Browning died in 1926, Saive continued developing semi-automatic rifle designs, recognizing that the bolt-action rifles of World War I were becoming obsolete. Every major military power could see this same writing on the wall. The Americans were working on what would become the M1 Garand. The Soviets were developing the SVT-40. Even the Germans were experimenting with semi-automatic designs. Saive developed a promising design that FN designated the model 1935. This wasn't the FN49 yet, but it contained many of the ideas that would eventually mature into that rifle. The Belgian military was interested. Several other countries evaluated prototypes. But then, in May 1940, the Wehrmacht invaded Belgium. The FN factory fell into German hands, and Saive had to make a choice. He fled to Britain, taking his designs with him, and eventually made his way to Canada, where he continued his work. During World War II, Saive kept refining his semi-automatic rifle concept, while also working on other projects, including contributions to what would become the Browning high-power pistol's wartime production. He watched as the Americans deployed the M1 Garand across every theater of war. He saw the Soviets field millions of semi-automatic rifles. He observed the Germans experiment with increasingly radical designs, culminating in the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. All of these lessons would inform his thinking. When the war ended in 1945, Saive returned to Belgium and to FN. The company needed to rebuild. The Belgian military needed to rearm. And there was a huge potential market. Dozens of nations around the world needed modern rifles, and many were suspicious of buying German designs or couldn't afford American production runs. This was FN's opportunity, and Saive had the design ready to go. He took all his pre-war experience, everything he'd learned during the war years, and created what he believed would be the ultimate semi-automatic battle rifle. But the world was changing faster than anyone realized. By 1949, military thinkers were already moving beyond the concept of a powerful semi-automatic rifle firing full-power rifle cartridges. The Germans had shown that intermediate cartridges and select fire capability were the future. The British were developing the EM2. The Soviets were working on the AK-47. Even Saive himself was beginning work on what would become the FAL. The era of the traditional battle rifle was ending just as the FN49 was being born. Dieudonné Saive approached the FN49's development with a clear philosophy: create a rifle that combined proven reliability with manufacturing practicality. He'd seen too many ambitious designs fail because they were too expensive to produce or too complex to maintain in the field. The FN49 needed to be something a conscript could maintain, a factory could build affordably, and a quartermaster could keep supplied. The operating system Saive chose was gas-operated, tilting bolt action. This wasn't revolutionary. Similar systems had been used before. But Saive refined it beautifully. A piston above the barrel drove the bolt carrier rearward, while a tilting bolt locked and unlocked through contact with a cam surface in the receiver. It was elegant, mechanically straightforward, and remarkably reliable. The rifle would run in desert sand, jungle humidity, and Arctic cold, something not every semi-automatic rifle of that era could claim. One of Saive's cleverest design choices was making the FN49 easily adaptable to different cartridges. The rifle could be manufactured to fire several different calibers without requiring a complete redesign. This wasn't just theoretical flexibility. FM actually produced versions in 7mm Mauser, 30 caliber Argentine service cartridge, and the 30-06 Springfield. Each version required only changes to the barrel, bolt face, and magazine. The basic action remained identical. This made the FN49 attractive to countries that wanted a modern semi-automatic rifle, but didn't want to change their existing ammunition logistics. Saive also paid careful attention to the sights. The FN49 featured an adjustable aperture rear sight, graduated out to 1,200 meters, and a protected front post. These were excellent sights for the era, far better than many competing designs. Accuracy was a priority, and the rifle delivered. In the hands of a trained shooter, the FN49 could reliably hit targets at ranges that would challenge many contemporary military rifles. The development process wasn't without challenges. Saive had to balance several competing requirements. The rifle needed to be accurate, but not so heavy that soldiers would hate carrying it. It needed to be robust, but manufacturable at reasonable cost. It needed to handle powerful rifle cartridges without beating itself to pieces, but remain controllable for average soldiers. Finding these balances required extensive testing and refinement. One interesting technical feature was the integral muzzle brake on some versions. This wasn't common on military rifles of the time, but it helped reduce recoil and muzzle climb, making the weapon more controllable during rapid fire. The gas system was also adjustable, allowing armorers to tune the rifle for different ammunition loads or environmental conditions. These were sophisticated features that showed FN's commitment to creating a truly refined weapon. The result of all this careful development was a rifle that simply worked. It was reliable, accurate, and pleasant to shoot. Soldiers who trained with it found it intuitive. Armorers found it maintainable. The FN49 was, by any objective measure, an excellent military rifle. It just arrived at exactly the wrong moment in history. Let's talk about what made the FN49 tick mechanically, because understanding the hardware helps explain why this rifle earned such respect from those who used it. The FN49 fired full-power rifle cartridges, depending on which version you're looking at. The most common variant used the 7mm Mauser cartridge, the same round that had armed much of Latin America for decades. Other versions were chambered in 30-06 Springfield or 765mm Argentine. These were all powerful rounds, the same class of ammunition used in bolt-action rifles from World War II. This is important because it tells us where the FN49 sat philosophically. It was designed as a battle rifle, not an assault rifle with an intermediate cartridge. The operating system used a short-stroke gas piston located above the barrel. When you fire the rifle, some of the propellant gas is tapped off through a port in the barrel. This gas drives a piston rearward a short distance, about half an inch, which then imparts momentum to the bolt carrier. The carrier drives backward. A cam surface causes the bolt to tilt and unlock from the receiver, and the action cycles. It's simple, proven, and reliable. The gas system was adjustable with 2 settings, allowing the shooter to increase gas flow if the rifle was dirty or if using weaker ammunition. The tilting bolt locked into the receiver through interrupted threads on the bolt's rear. When the bolt tilted up into battery, these lugs engaged corresponding surfaces in the receiver, creating a solid lockup that could handle the pressures of full-power rifle cartridges. When the action cycled, the bolt tilted down out of engagement and could move rearward freely. This tilting bolt design was robust and less prone to fouling than some rotating bolt systems. Magazine capacity was 10 rounds, loaded via a detachable box magazine. Now here's something interesting. Early versions of the FN49 were designed to be loaded with stripper clips like a Mauser, not detachable magazines. Some variants had a fixed magazine that was charged from above. Later versions switched to a fully detachable magazine system, which was more practical but added a potential point of loss or damage in the field. The magazine release was located just forward of the trigger guard, easily accessible to the shooter's trigger finger. The rifle measured about 44 inches overall, with a barrel length of roughly 23 inches. It weighed about 9.5 pounds empty, which was comparable to the M1 Garand and lighter than many contemporary military rifles. The weight was well distributed, making the rifle feel balanced in the hands. The stock was wood, typically walnut, and was well shaped for shouldering and aiming. Rate of fire in semi-automatic mode was as fast as you could pull the trigger, theoretically up to 40 rounds per minute for a trained shooter, though sustained firing at that rate would be impractical. The rifle's sights, barrel length, and accuracy potential made it effective out to 600 or 700 yards in the hands of a skilled marksman, with the sights optimistically graduated out to 1,200 meters. Construction was traditional: a machined steel receiver, a chrome-lined barrel in many versions, and quality wood furniture. This was old-school gunsmithing at its finest, not the stamped metal and plastic that would soon dominate military firearms production. It made the FN49 expensive to produce compared to what was coming, but it also made it extremely durable and pleasant to shoot. The FN49 saw service with several nations, though never in the quantities or prominence that its designers might have hoped. The Belgian military adopted it, naturally, though by the early 1950s they were already looking toward the FAL. Egypt purchased it in significant numbers and used it during the Suez crisis. Venezuela, Colombia, Luxembourg, and Indonesia all bought FN49 rifles in various quantities and calibers. The most significant combat use came with Egyptian forces. During the Suez crisis of 1956, Egyptian soldiers armed with FN49 rifles faced British, French, and Israeli troops. Reports from this conflict praised the rifle's accuracy and reliability. Egyptian troops found the FN49 superior to their older bolt-action rifles, and the weapon performed well in the desert environment. However, the conflict also highlighted the changing nature of warfare. Engagement ranges were often shorter than expected, and the ability to lay down suppressive fire was increasingly valued over precision-aimed fire at long range. Venezuelan troops used their FN49 rifles, chambered in 7mm Mauser, for decades. These rifles proved remarkably durable, remaining in service well into the 1970s in some units. Colombian forces similarly found the rifle reliable and accurate. The feedback from soldiers in these armies was consistently positive. The FN49 was easy to shoot accurately, didn't malfunction in harsh conditions, and was intuitive to operate. But even as soldiers praised the rifle, the military establishments were moving on. the rifle's inability to fire fully automatic was increasingly seen as a limitation. The trend toward lighter intermediate cartridges made the FN49's full-power ammunition seem old-fashioned. And most importantly, FN itself was promoting the FAL, a more modern design that could fire both semi-automatic and fully automatic, and which could be more economically produced. Some countries that purchased the FN49 experimented with modifications. There were attempts to add select fire capability, though these were not widely adopted. Some rifles received scope mounts for use in sniper or designated marksman roles, where the FN49's inherent accuracy was valued. Indonesian rifles were sometimes modified with different furniture or sights based on local preferences. Compared to its contemporaries, the FN49 held its own admirably. It was more reliable than the French MAS-49. It was easier to manufacture than the Swiss rifles of the era. It was more refined than the various Soviet designs. Against the American M1 Garand, the comparison was closer. The Garand had a longer track record and American backing, but the FN49 had better sights and was easier to reload thanks to its detachable magazine. In pure mechanical terms, the FN49 was arguably the better rifle. But the Garand had history on its side. The rifle's service life was ultimately cut short, not by any failing of the design, but by the march of technology. As nations that had purchased the FN49 in the early 1950s reached the 1960s, they started replacing it with FALs, G3s, or AK-47s. The FN49 was too expensive to manufacture compared to stamped metal designs, and its semi-automatic-only operation seemed increasingly inadequate. By the 1970s, the FN49 was largely retired from frontline service, though some remained in reserve stocks or with second-line units. The FN49's legacy is complex. From one perspective, it was a commercial failure. FN sold just around 170,000 rifles over the production run, a fraction of what the FAL or other contemporary rifles would achieve. It never became the standard rifle of a major military power. It didn't influence the course of any major conflict. Within a decade of its introduction, it was already obsolescent. But from another perspective, the FN49 represents something important in firearms development. It was the bridge between the M1 Garand generation and the FAL generation. It proved that European manufacturers could produce semi-automatic rifles that equaled or exceeded American designs in quality and reliability. The lessons Saive learned in developing the FN49 directly informed his work on the FAL, which would go on to arm half the free world during the Cold War. For collectors and firearms enthusiasts today, the FN49 occupies a special place. These rifles are prized for their accuracy, craftsmanship, and historical interest. They represent the last gasp of traditional military rifle design before everything shifted to stamped metal, plastic furniture, and select fire capability. Shooting an FN49 today, you can feel the quality of its construction, the smoothness of its action, the care that went into its design. The rifle also serves as a reminder of how quickly military technology can change. The gap between the FN49's conception and its obsolescence was barely a decade. The weapon that seemed like the future in 1945 was clearly the past by 1955. This rapid evolution would characterize the entire Cold War period, as weapons systems became outdated at an accelerating pace. What can we learn from the FN49? Perhaps that excellence isn't always enough. You can design and build a superb rifle, but if the military doctrine has moved beyond your design philosophy, commercial success will remain elusive. The FN49 was a victim of perfect timing, meeting the wrong moment in history. It deserved to be more widely adopted and more successful than it was. But the world had moved on. The FN49 deserves to be remembered as more than just a footnote in firearms history. It was a genuinely excellent rifle, beautifully engineered and thoughtfully designed. Soldiers who used it praised its accuracy and reliability. The fact that it failed commercially had nothing to do with the quality of the design and everything to do with the rapid evolution of military thinking in the post-war period. This rifle represents the end of an era, the final refinement of a philosophy of military small arms that stretched back to the late 19th century. Powerful cartridges, precision fire, solid construction. Within a few years of the FN49's introduction, that entire philosophy would be swept away by assault rifles and stamped metal and plastic. But for a brief moment, Dieudonné Saive and Fabrique Nationale showed the world what that older philosophy could achieve when executed with skill and craftsmanship. If you ever get the chance to handle an FN49, take it. You'll be holding a piece of forgotten history, a road not taken in military firearms development. And if you found this story interesting, hit the like button and consider subscribing. Also, let me know what other weapons you'd like to hear about. There are hundreds of these stories out there. Thanks for watching.